So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our Future of Work discussion this evening. I'm going to kick off with a quote actually that Siobhan Godley and I were discussing a while ago because it felt really, really appropriate for this topic, which is Albert Einstein's favourite quote, or famous quote rather: "If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd probably spend 55 minutes working out the proper question. And then once I know the proper question, it's going to take me 5 minutes to solve the problem." And the reason I'm starting this is because I think before we all leap into post-COVID, future of work, solutioning, it feels like we've all got to ask ourselves what the right question is, because everybody's start point around this topic is really different. And as I was considering tonight, it felt really appropriate to start with that, and for everybody throughout the discussion this evening to kind of keep coming back to that. So welcome to 90 minutes of expert discussion. I'm going to introduce the panel first. So first we have Mike Gedye. Mike is the EMEA head of the technology sector vertical for CBRE. He's a recognised expert in corporate occupier real estate strategies, and we were just discussing his huge passion for emerging and disruptive technologies and what that can do to help workplaces become way more productive. So welcome, Mike. Josef.Hargrave is Associate Director for Arup's Foresight Research and Innovation team. He's leading a multidisciplinary team of consultants who specialise in strategy, innovation, thought leadership and vision making. And one of the things that they're working on quite passionately at the moment is the future of work. Welcome, Josef.
Thank you. Welcome.
We have Payal Vasudeva, who is the Human Capital Partner for Deloitte's Financial Services practice, with over 20 years of experience in architecting and deploying strategic people initiatives and large transformation programs. Welcome, Payal. And last but not least, Russ McMillan, who is also a partner with Deloitte with over 20 years Big Four experience with the large corporate occupiers, and he helps transform the workplace operating model and absolutely the cost base. Russ leads the financial services sector client relationships, and he co-leads the future of workplace proposition from Deloitte. So welcome, Russ. So before we get into the session, I thought I'd just spend a minute sort of telling you guys really about what's keeping me up at night, thinking about this future of work. And I kind of came up with 5 big topics that I think are all related to this. The first one for me is I'm a huge sustainability champion, and I've been so thrilled to see the impacts of COVID-19 from a pollution reduction perspective. You know, you don't really think you're going to talk about COVID in a positive way, but actually for the planet, it's bizarrely been a really positive thing for air pollution. If I take London as just an example, you know, the Mayor's Office last week reported that harmful nitrogen dioxide was down 50% and secondary pollutants were down 33%. And actually, when you pretty much look around the globe to the major cities, they're all saying roughly the same thing, which is just huge. The second big thing for me is philanthropy. You know, I work for a company, and one of the things I love working for Deutsche Bank is our huge philanthropy and CSR perspective. The Conversation Journal reported last month that philanthropy had hit unprecedented levels, both from companies and individuals. In fact, by the end of March, it had already raised more than $1 billion US, which, to put it into context, is 3 times anything that was raised for Ebola or Hurricane Harvey. And I think what's been really exciting about this, and why it's relevant to our conversation today, is that it's taken such different forms. It's not just been money, it's been about repurposing factories, workers, supporting the healthcare services and frontline services. And it really does make me think, you know, is there a different way we could all be pooling resources on behalf of communities? And is this part of the future of work? Another big issue, and Payal will talk on this later, is talent from anywhere. You know, it's, as a global company, we tend to think we could hire from anywhere all the time, but actually you find you're quite tied to wherever you are as a location strategy perspective. And the world is my oyster's now just taken on a whole new meaning for me in the future of work. So how will that play into what we think about as the construct of the future of work? As a senior female leader, and a crew board member. I also think about diversity a lot, and in real estate industry, you know, we've still got a long way to go in this discussion. And I think one of the things that's been really worrying me is, as we come out of lockdown, what will that mean for women in the workplace? Will we be stereotyped once again as the primary caregiver, and therefore men will come back into the workplace and women will not? And what will that mean? Will there be a lasting impact, or will it be short term? And you know, I'm really quite worried about that, and it's a topic that I bring up as we're talking about it in the bank. It's something that I've raised several times for us to be really mindful of. And last but not least, we're all from the world of real estate, and I'm fascinated to see what all of this means in terms of future of work for the role of the office. And so as we go through today, hopefully we can answer some of those questions. So enough from me. I'm now going to start putting our panel to work. And so maybe, Joseph, I start with you. You know, bearing in mind the first quote from Einstein, you know, what question should we all be starting with as we think about the future of work?
Thank you, Kathryn. And an easy question to open, of course, the question about a question. I guess before we ask the question, I think we must first understand and explore the current context a little bit more. I guess the pre-work before Einstein's pre-work. I think the first thing to consider is that change comes in many different shapes. There's fast change, slow change, disruptive, gentle, and silent. And right now we are definitely in this idea of fast and disruptive change, which is quite unique in many ways. So COVID-19 and the pandemic and what it's causing is really a so-called wildcard or black swan, these rare, unpredictable, high impact events. So in that context, I think first, before even looking at work, we really need to ask questions and think about plausible scenarios and pathways for the macro context. So how will our economies evolve? How will health systems evolve in the context of the continued pandemic? Because we're of course still in the middle of it. And as a consequence of that, what really are the unique pathways that the world might take, and how might work then evolve within those different macro pathways, if you like. We also need to think and ask questions along different timelines. I think, again, when we think about the future, that's very important, whether you're developing new visions or trying to understand risk or trying to understand the opportunities associated with this. It's always important to, yes, think about the kind of short term, but also have this view to the medium and long term all the time, because that matters in this situation, which feels very acute, as much as it does in others. And so the question that slowly leads me to is this idea of, well, what future do we want to emerge after this? You know, what is our vision for a better place, independent of solving the current challenges? You know, what's the kind of future we want in terms of work and life? And then let's think about, you know, what we can do in terms of how this situation can actually accelerate the positives, because there were things that we were trying to do before COVID-19, which maybe we can address or achieve in a very different and perhaps accelerated way now. Some of the things around sustainability and shift in people's travel patterns and air travel and all of those kind of things. So, you know, you could argue that maybe part of this new normal has already happened. We talk a lot at the moment about this is the new normal. And so questions start to emerge there around, well, what will carry on, what will stick? But what we also have to recognize right now when we ask questions about the current situation and the future of work is that really we aren't in the new normal yet. We were in one extreme before, where most of us were spending time in offices. Now we are in the other extreme. Once we can go back to the office again, that's when we will start to find this new equilibrium, which is shaped by our current experience. And as a consequence, the new normal, I think, will only emerge once we get to some kind of degree of normality. Because right now we're rethinking community, we're rethinking what family means, we're rethinking globalization and supply chains. You know, the challenges around PPE have really highlighted that maybe, you know, globalization isn't so great after all, and lean manufacturing isn't so great after all. We're rethinking the role of key workers, like you said, and you know, in many cases maybe the role of men has to change, because in a lot of households the women were the key workers. So in some cases at least, the men had to step up and do more childcare, and so there's lots and lots of societal and economic shifts happening there. And I think, again, the question that I would ask is really, what future do we want to emerge after this, and what opportunities do we want to accelerate?
Brilliant. When you think about that, because I know you talk to many clients across really varied sectors, can you hear, you know, anybody, you know, are you seeing any emerging trends that you believe will actually manifest, or is it, you know, is it really still too early?
I think the other thing that we have to recognize with that question is that, of course, the experiences and challenges are at the moment are varying quite wildly across sectors. You know, we here in this forum probably take quite a kind of knowledge worker based view. And we operate in a kind of a certain sector. Some sectors are suffering really badly, and others are thriving right now. You know, there's many organizations which are embracing this new world of e-commerce and the acceleration of digitalization, which is, you know, giving some companies huge opportunities to expand and do things differently and reach new markets. It was just in the news yesterday that Ocado, the online supermarket here in the UK, has 1 million customers that wants to join them, and they just can't keep up with the demand. And so, what then I think matters for us in many instances for organizations in this change is really our adaptive capacity. And some sectors and some organizations are just better to adapt within the current challenge. And so that's a bit of a question, you know, how agile are we to change, and how does that compare across different organizational needs? And so adaptive capacity is a thing that determines quite a bit how different organizations are responding to this change. I mean, the obvious one is that digital is accelerating. Everything is becoming digital e-commerce, and I'm sure that colleagues on this call will talk about that much more broadly. I think the thing to say about that is that both the pros and the limits of digital are being exposed in quite extreme ways. As we've all experienced, you know, a lot of people are now much more isolated as the pandemic has continued, as they have been before, and that kind of the limits of digitally induced isolation are becoming quite clear. I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about the future of cities, and I think one of the interesting opportunities that we're seeing emerging now is this idea of much more multi-nodal cities. So moving away from the city center, and this idea of much more happening in neighborhoods. And so, you know, looking at a sector like retail, for example, that could also be an opportunity, because in some of these more regional centers, there might be shopping center assets, for example, which can be transformed into places that have a much broader usage around co-working or healthcare facilities or new forms of community services. So I think this multi-nodal city, this more neighborhood-based working, experiencing, meeting people, I think that's a big trend we're seeing. There's lots and lots of change around transport and commuting patterns, of course. Huge transformations there. You know, lots of cities now trying to accelerate more sustainable forms of commuting, enabling fast and agile adoption of more cycling infrastructure, for example, and encouraging more walking. There's lots and lots of questions there around existing public transport assets and the financial viability of those in the future, and possible usage patterns of those. And of course, again, also negative impacts of this shift, where car use is suddenly, you know, massively expanding because people don't want to go on public transport anymore. So there's actually more traffic gridlock in some instances than there has been before. I think the importance of health and well-being, as a kind of final comment, that has really, I think, us all suffering from the same health anxiety at the same time, I think has had quite a profound effect on how people talk about health, first of all, because we've had a common topic to talk about there, to share our health concerns, and in general, just you know, the overall importance of health and well-being, and how our lives relate to health and well-being, the risks associated with living existing lifestyles and being exposed to stuff. Again, independent of the specificity of COVID, I think that has highlighted quite a few things around health and well-being, perhaps mattering more now to people than it has in the past. So those are just a few things.
No, I mean, that's excellent. And, you know, thinking about that and building on it, you know, as we think about culture, how much has that got to shift to capture the benefits of all of this, right? Because, you know, the things that you've just pointed out are, you know, new ways of working, new ways of travel, increased flexibility in the workplace. You know, all of us work for companies, we're all thinking about this. How can we make sure that we are set up to be able to adapt to, you know, you talked about the adaptive capacity. You know, how can a company measure its adaptive capacity and then make those cultural shifts to take advantage of it?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I guess, where we can get a bit more into the topic of work. And I think a few things there are becoming clear. I think the first thing that's becoming clear is that suddenly employers will have a much greater responsibility for what happens in people's homes in terms of when they work there. Because what it has been previously a bit of a luxury, okay, you know, you're free to work at home 1 day a week or 2 days a week max, and, you know, you're going to look after yourself, what your ergonomic setup is like and so forth. That doesn't really fly anymore, because if you've got all of your workforce sat at home wanting to be productive, and you're essentially forcing them to be at home because of the health situation, then as an employer, perhaps you should also take greater responsibility of ensuring that people have the right ergonomic setup, proper desks, proper screens, and so forth. So suddenly the responsibility of the employer expands, and that's, you know, that's a change in cultural norm, because it means that the boundaries between home and work are blurring much more, also from a kind of process standpoint. But again, you know, the question we're trying to answer time and time again, and we already starting to try to answer that question before COVID-19, is really where and how does the office matter, right? We have these conversations all the time when we think about the future of work, when someone's building a new office. Well, you know, what is this office for and what is the purpose? And that has now again, I think, really been pushed into the spotlight, this idea of, well, once we can go back, why would we want to go back? And the kind of the idea of social interaction and meeting people and collaborating with people, that's so high on people's desire list right now. I think at the beginning it was kind of fine and interesting and maybe a bit relaxing to work at home. The dialogue around that, at least in my world, has totally changed. It's all about, God, we really miss being in the office now. We miss having these interactions. And so the question then becomes, again, what will be the new equilibrium? And what will that mean, for example, for the proportion of desk you will need? Because if you go into the office 3 days a week for meetings and interactions, and you might not even sit at a desk the whole time you're in the office, and your desk time is kind of like at home, that totally changes the way the floor plates are arranged, how much space you actually need, the capacity of your building, and. So I think that's the interesting question, is how much of it will carry over afterwards, and what that new equilibrium will look like.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly something we're thinking about. If I think about this and expand it further, you know, we start to then come into that implicit contract between employer and employee. And in the future of work, you know, that is going to look quite different in terms of the expectation level. Payal, maybe you can help me here. You know, how far will trust between companies' employees have to go in order to make this work?
So I think, just following on from what Joseph just said, right, I think absolutely agree that I don't think we are in the new normal. That is going to be defined in due course. But what is becoming apparent is that the longer we continue in the way that we are, we're all adapting, we're all embracing this at an individual level, at a team level, at an organizational level. And that is fundamentally going to start redefining our ways of working. And I think the future looks like it's going to be increasingly hybrid, right? With you know, proportion of the workforce working virtually, a proportion physically in the workplace, fair amount of agility and flexibility between the two. So culture and mindset then start playing quite a significant role. And as we start thinking about this integration of human and technology, I think trust and transparency really come into focus. And a few thoughts there from me. I think first and foremost, I think the importance of having really transparent and authentic communication becomes key. in the everyday. And this is about what employees can expect going forwards. Clearly, this is uncharted territory. Everybody's navigating this space, but just having clear and consistent communication, I think, becomes quite important. We internally at Deloitte have been checking in quite regularly with our people, not just in terms of the content of the communication, but also the type and frequency of our communication to see actually, is this being well received? What do we need to dial up? What do we need to dial down? And increasingly, ourselves and other organizations are using more digital tools to have these conversations. So this isn't just about traditional surveys and communicating through sort of, memos that would go out. This is about actually engaging as you communicate. And I think that's really important. The second thing I would say is that as you talk about trust, I think it's going to be quite important to almost create psychological safety to promote innovation and experimentation so that traditional problems are solved in new ways enabled by technology. Because I don't think this is about just replicating the office at home, right? Which is essentially what a lot of us are doing at the moment, right? And I would argue this is not the future of work, where we are in back-to-back Zoom or team calls and then check emails and with some collaboration platform. We need to be thinking about new ways of working, embracing technology, embracing digital, and say, what's the better way of doing this? And I think organizations here really do have an opportunity to push the envelope in how they sort of integrate human and technology, right? And think about it more as kind of almost augmentation or a collaboration strategy, but which is human-centered in design. And then from that, I would just add to say that I think culture and leadership practices play a huge role here, because it's all well and good to say we should have experimentation, innovation, and more trusted environment, but actually do people fundamentally feel empowered? And I think encouraging open dialogue so that you can co-create on some of these solutions, I think become really important, because this is going to be about how you measure value and impact and contribution, which is more about outcome, right? Rather than actually checking up on people. This is about checking in. And that requires actually a real focus on line manager capability to be able to do this effectively.
I mean, that's fascinating, because one of the things I think a lot of companies will struggle with as they consider, that hybrid model and the value chain proposition within it, is how do you measure productivity? Just how much work can productively be done from home? And I think that's one of the most nebulous things that companies are grappling with now to try and measure. Do you have any, Deloitte have any view on that productivity measuring?
So I think with productivity, it's almost sort of that holy grail, right? And there is no silver bullet around this, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to productivity. But that said, again, back to your point around just sort of the data that we have seen through this period, and fair to say it's been a few months, is indicative of the fact that workforce sentiment is saying, well, actually, this has on balance been a positive experience. On balance, and I know this is self-reported, is that productivity has been the same or has improved. And actually, we want more choice and flexibility in terms of how we work, and we would like to work 2 to 3 days from home, given a choice. So you're seeing some sentiment come through in that. Now, if you start thinking about the productivity question, I think one also has to watch how the space evolves, right? We feel we're all working longer hours, the commute time's gone. Once we see easing of certain restrictions, more of the social restrictions, I think it'll be interesting to see actually what happens from a productivity standpoint as well. Now, in some instances, easier to measure productivity. So we've seen that come through in organizations that have more process or task-driven activities. So, for example, call centers, right? So call handling. And in some cases, they've really doubled down in terms of making sure customer engagement, employee experience is positive, and they've seen an uptick in call handling metrics, et cetera. So productivity, you could say, has gone up.
Wow.
We see that in some banks where they've seen KYC check processing just happen. Those numbers seem to have gone up. And so we are seeing sort of some of those sort of measures come through, but then not everything we do can clearly be measured from an outcome perspective, because that's not how we have traditionally organized ourselves. So I think it's actually more important to think about how do you reduce productivity leakage, understand what might be the blockers to productivity and related inefficiencies. Because if you believe that actually productivity is underpinned by motivation and engagement, then actually what are the things that we need to do that actually then bring about an uplift of productivity? And I think here there's some quick things that I can just sound out. I think first and foremost for me would be starting with leadership, because I think that sets the tone in terms of how teams behave, what is acceptable, how you can be more outcome driven and impact driven in what you're measuring, how much flexibility and empowerment are you giving people. I think secondly is the technology, right? So having the right mix of digital platforms and technology. And this isn't about technology for technology's sake, but about accelerating those new ways of working by encouraging people to connect, collaborate, deliver value. Thirdly, I would say is visibility. Make that almost sort of tacit knowledge explicit. Find ways in which you can make that visible across teams and how you can use virtual locations to share knowledge. And it should be real time. It's not just meeting by default, but actually it's about how can you have more asynchronous communication, creating new habits with new kinds of technology. And then the workplace itself, because if we have to create that seamless experience between physical and virtual, making sure that actually the physical space that you're working in actually enhances your productivity, your well-being, and it's fit for purpose. And finally, to your point, Kathryn, as you said earlier, is be inclusive. Because, for example, we found quite early on, as we deployed Zoom, that we got some feedback from some of our inclusion groups saying that video calls were quite anxiety causing for some of our neurodiverse groups. And giving everybody a choice that if they could have that video on or off was their choice, made a huge difference, right? And initially all line managers, of course, out of just being completely well-meaning and enthusiastic, were like, great, everybody switch your videos on, right? And let's get that going. And actually the feedback we got was this wasn't inclusive for everyone. So making that small adjustment really helped. And I think similarly, you know, when we're in an office, there might be some people who are not as extroverted. If that's anyway the case, it's probably going to get more pronounced when you're in a virtual environment. So again, making sure that everybody has a voice is quite important. So I think those are some of the things from a productivity standpoint, where I think thinking about where you can get some efficiencies, where you can remove some of the blockers and friction around what might be causing productivity leakage, I think is really important.
No, that's fascinating. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think the inclusivity piece is really important. We had some similar feedback from team members that were, is it okay that I don't have the video on all day? I think one, they found it quite exhausting looking at the screen all day. And I think secondly, it is quite exposing for some people. So I think I think a lot of these things we're learning, right, where we hadn't tested them maybe in anger and on the scale that we're doing it. So I think that's absolutely fascinating. Maybe changing tack a little bit. One of the big pieces of feedback that I've had from junior members of staff is they're really worried about what this means for their career. If they're never in the office and never spending time with senior leaders, maybe getting work shadowing opportunities into meetings and things like that, how can they grow their experience, and how can they ensure that they're noticed by senior leaders when it comes to promotion time?
I think that's a great question, because I think talent development just as a whole is just a key area of focus at the moment. And as you said, we're all kind of navigating this space. I think it's even more pronounced for those who are relatively new to the organization. Yeah. I mean, if you join through this period, can you just imagine what your sort of experience of the workplace has been, right? And what we're finding, interestingly enough, is that the teaming aspect actually hasn't suffered as much, right? Because we've all adapted organically. All kinds of sort of interesting and fun things are happening, almost at line level, to get people together, to do social activities, etc. So we found that the experience of being part of a team has come about actually maybe in slightly new and creative ways, but is happening. But what's harder is some of that learning in the flow of work, right? The things that would just happen in the workplace almost by osmosis, because you'd have some more experienced or senior colleagues around, and actually they would be nurturing the talent, and that learning would just come from the doing. And that we find is where now the focus is. And again, it's not that we haven't had virtual learning before and self-paced learning, but I think the emphasis now on that blended learning piece, to say, in whatever that new future workplace is, it's actually going to become a key feature, where it is going to be a place where you need to configure it such that you are emphasizing community and culture and innovation and learning, because that is fundamentally going to be part of that purpose of a workplace, if you will, going forward. I think it's also throwing a light on a number of other sort of broader talent pieces as well, because like I said earlier, the line manager capability to be able to manage in this environment, right? It's as much as the individual trying to learn and assimilate into the organization, but the ability of managers to be able to help them do that and support them in the right way, because they're equally navigating uncharted territory. So I think that is equally a focus in terms of how do you uplift their capability. I think the other thing is, as was mentioned earlier, is this access to potentially dispersed talent pools. So if we're saying that actually location proximity is not going to be as much of almost a barrier to talent, then again, thinking about talent pools in a more dispersed way, and then having to being able to meet their unique needs and challenges is also going to be something that organizations need to start considering. And then thinking about also performance management, as I said earlier, because how do you actually measure performance, especially if you are in an organization where presenteeism has been really valued, where actually from the most senior person downwards, everybody shows up, and that's the culture of the place. And it's as much senior leaders and their mindset that is what good looks like, right? Because that's what they've known their entire careers. And actually to flip that and say, this isn't about the face time that people show, but it's about the impact and the value that they're actually delivering. And I think those are the things that actually are really going to come into fore in terms of what this means from almost a talent development perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we've experienced, as you quite rightly said, in that virtual world of leadership, is we've had to sort of say to people, take regular breaks, because that whole culture of presenteeism has just literally translated to somebody sitting for even longer periods of time at their desk in front of a screen, because every meeting is on screen. So you're not getting away from your desk to go and meet in a meeting room or going for coffee or wherever else. And so, you know, one of the things that we've really had to do is say to people, please take a break. And we've had to get senior managers to do that, to permit it, because I think junior members of staff were feeling like they always had to be available by their screen in case anybody called them up on the screen. And I think, you know, that's one of the learnings I took away from it, is to say to people, hey, I'm not available for half an hour because I'm going to go and have lunch in the back garden and get away from, you know, my screen for half an hour. And I noticed then my whole team did it. And actually, we didn't see one bit of issue with productivity. In fact, if anything, I think it got better because people were then realized they could take a break. So I think that's absolutely fascinating. You know, turning now maybe and thinking about that whole technology piece, you know, Mike, we're seeing user demands evolving at a rate that, I mean, certainly I've never seen it before. You know, if I think of some of the amazing things that Deutsche Bank's managed to get digital, things like, you know, DocuSign, full digital mail service delivery up and running in just a matter of weeks. And we've been trying for 2 or 3 years, you know, without much success with some of the regulators. And finally, COVID has released that. You know, what are you seeing in terms of primary platforms or ways that people can connect and create community through these platforms?
It's been really interesting discussion so far, because I think you've touched on quite a few of the themes that we've seen as it relates to digital and how it contributes to the enablement of both the physical spaces. And at the moment, we're talking about the remote spaces more than the physical, as people have yet to return fully to work, and how it optimizes human performance. And I think one of the first things I'd say is that Payal referenced the movement away from synchronous to asynchronous working. And the adoption that we've all made of remote working has been taking the office back home, where we're dealing with this one-to-one technology-enabled communication. I think companies that pre-COVID had embraced distributed working recognized very quickly that the art to working on technology platforms isn't to rely on synchronous platforms, but is to adapt and adopt many different forms of communication in an asynchronous way. I mean, there's some great examples of companies. One that springs to mind is Automatic, which is a 1,200 person company, technology company that is in 75 countries. They have no offices, and they've used different forms of communication, and they rely less and less on email and less on direct communication. So the first thing, I guess, is recognizing that you can work in an asynchronous way, and you should embrace that to allow the extroverts and introverts to achieve their own performance levels based on their preferences. The second thing around platforms, I guess, is that I do want to bring it back to the physical, because as we start to adapt and return to work, technology is going to be a massive enabler to access the right kind of spaces and the right kinds of resources, recognizing that the workforce is largely distributed and that you need to be dealing with complexity, because it used to be fairly binary. You had a desk, you had a seat, you went to work. Now the employer is going to have to figure out through technology, how do they allocate the right spaces and the right solutions at the right levels of capacity, and how do they make sure that what they're offering is fit for purpose? There's no longer find me a place to work, it's find me the right place to achieve my objectives for that particular task. So I think technology is going to be an accelerator of enabling that to happen more fluently, in a more personalized way, and in a more automated, efficient way. And the obvious place to start is at the edge of the computing, which is to the device, to the employee, wherever they are, recognizing that the equilibrium we're talking about isn't going to be about home versus work. It's going to be everywhere and everywhere in between. Yeah. So we're seeing the emergence of apps which have pivoted away from being simply engagement apps or building applications to being the device that through which you can engage learning, collaboration, communication, but also you can start to use it as a transactional tool to book and wayfind and reserve the places that you will choose to work in, which may be at home, which may be sometimes in a flexible space, which isn't your own corporate space, but it may be a combination of all three in one day that you'll be doing this as you move around your working life.
Awesome. I mean, honestly, I completely agree. And I think, you know, from my perspective, what's going to be really interesting is how easy it is to use, because when we think about it, one of the fascinating facts that I love to bore everybody with at Deutsche Bank is when we're moving into our new building in 21 Moorfields, you know, we'll have 5 generations in the workplace. And yeah, how do you design an inclusive workplace for 5 generations that have different adoption rates of technology, different ways of working, different ways of measuring productivity or value proposition in the workplace? And thinking about that, you know, how are we going to make sure that these technology applications are, you know, I guess inclusive and everybody can access them confidently? Because I guess one of the big concerns I have, being somebody that is absolutely useless with technology, is that somehow you get left behind in this new virtual world of, as you say, a home and work and everything in between. And what we're going to rely on more and more is that ability to connect through various platforms to do various tasks. And if you can't do that, you're not included in the in the gang, right? So,
and I'd also add that there's probably a 6th. We've just produced a report called the Responsive Real Estate, which says that actually might be a further generation of work alongside the 5 that you referenced, which is AI, yes, recognizing that machine learning and automation and intelligent systems will augment the capabilities of the human performance. So that needs to be integrated within this working platform as well. Now, the inclusivity as it relates to learning, it touches on everything that we've talked about today, and no one's really referenced it specifically, which is change management. You know, if you're embarking on any pilot, small or medium, you would incorporate within the work streams change management to make sure that whatever you've gone from to is embraced by everybody, is understood by everybody, the purpose, the vision, and then the execution of it. And I'm sure Russell will pick this up later on. Is sustained through change management. And yet we've gone on the world's biggest pilot of change without any investment in change management, and wonder, quite frankly, how it's worked at all. So I think as we do return to a new normal and equilibrium, then change management has to come to the fore. The training, the engagement, the inclusivity through learning, and the choices, because at the end of the day, some people will prefer not to work in certain ways compared to others, as the generations will be vastly different. So giving people fluidity of choice, not only in terms of space, but also resources and the ways they want to work to meet their preferences and their style, and also their function. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work around cognitive behavioral sort of performance as it relates to the physical environment. And it's very clear that different personas and different personality types need different stimulus in order for them to be effective and efficient. And I think the same will relate to technology. We all have different needs based on our personalities and our function and our I guess, our personality traits.
So I guess putting you on the spot, you know, are you in a position to predict maybe some longer term, more permanent changes in occupier behaviours that CBRE are looking at? You know, I know that, you know, we're working with you on, you know, adopting your host platform to help us through that journey. You know, are you seeing, you know, things that you as a company are putting a bet on to really manage through that?
Yeah, there's a number of areas that we would be making very big bets on, and Josef touched on some of them. You know, the idea that resilience of people relies on the removal of anxiety and the promotion of health and wellness, and we see significant opportunities through technology of developing buildings and workplaces which were far more transparent in the way they communicate the quality of health and the quality of the environments, which will remove the anxiety. If you know how clean it is, you know the quality of the air particles, and autonomous and touchless workplaces as well, where you can feel comfort that you don't have to touch your way around the buildings. So that's a clear prediction that the health and well-being agenda will move from a nice to have to a fundamental core requisite of any building. The second thing will be around user experience and around making that fluidity of workplace practice far more convenient and far more personalized through devices and through the ability for the building environment to remember your preferences. Now, this assumes a transfer of trust between the employee and the worker and the landlord or the employer in terms of capturing their preferences and adopting buildings to them. But I think if we can embrace that, it'll probably start with willingness to share information in order to protect our personal health. But once that gets ingrained in the way that we trust the transfer of our preferences, then we'll be able to create really interesting environments where personalized selection of resource and seats and environments and heat and sound will be really tuned in to the individual's preference. And I think the last thing for me in terms of key bets will be around, I guess, on the supply side. We've talked a lot about the demand side, but on the supply side, it'll be how do you start to preempt and predict the provision of space as an employer in order to provide that efficiently without waste and without sort of huge emptiness on a Monday and Friday because everyone elects to work from home, as we tend to. And that's at a small pilot level. Once you go to the whole workforce choosing to work from home, you could be carrying a huge capacity. So I predict that we'll be starting to use IoT sensors and machine learning to take far more aggregated insights into historic demand and predicted demand, and then to distribute that space on a far more predictive basis to remove that waste and also to align the right product to the right needs of the right employee.
I love that. I mean, certainly that's the thing that I think is consuming us in real estate in Deutsche is, you know, how do we manage that through the week to make sure that we don't have everybody in on the same day and then nobody's working experience in the office is great, right? Because there's just not enough to go around.
The last thing I want to do is say to people, come into the office and come in and there's no one they've ever recognized before sitting around them. And they think I could have been sitting at home and saved myself 2 hours on the train. So it's about using that data, not just to manage the supply, but also to manage the teams working with the best adjacencies on the right days of the week. So you can manufacture serendipity and actually create those collisions through technology rather than through chance.
No, I love that. Absolutely love that. And I think you're right. I think a lot of it is going to be because a lot of companies now with GDPR regulations, they're going to have to put it down to the choice of the employee as to whether to share their data freely. It'll be the only way those sorts of platforms. And so I think it's going to be a real trust challenge and step for individuals and companies to overcome if they really want to manage this thing.
It's a
with
trust value
intelligence.
trade-off, isn't it? The trust is, I trust you to use the information appropriately, but my expectation is if I give you my data, I get a value return.
Yeah.
So, you know, we've trusted taxi companies who come on demand with my location and my information, but the value is I don't have to stand in the rain with my arm out hoping a taxi might stop. Yeah. And I think you have to show the right value creation in order for the employee or the individual to trust the transfer of their data.
I love that. So Russell, we've just been talking about, you know, culture, process, technology that can underpin it, but ultimately, I guess what I would like to know is, you know, how do we make sure we don't wander into the beauty of contemplation around this future of work and never actually do anything. Because, you know, I think all of us have at times worked on projects where we've spent a really long time in that beauty of solving it and then never actually solved it. So what are the tips that you can give us all about how to launch, I guess, a really good program to deliver on this?
Okay, and that's a great question, and it's, you know, it's the $10 million question for some clients. For some other clients, it's the $100 million question. I mean, this is like a big opportunity, and I'm going to hedge my answer if I may, but try and tie it together. We see an opportunity to act at pace around this, and some of the reasons for that is it's always easier to add things back in than take things away. I mean, lots of people in the organization might jump at the opportunity to get back into the office 2 or 3 days a week, and that might be much easier than letting people come back and organizations be very elastic and return to 5 days, and then in a couple of years' time try and get things chipped away again. We'll have lost lots of the benefits that, as I think Mike said, we've been plunged into this huge working from home pilot that's, you know, on balance been a success. So I think, you know, acting quickly because, you know, we're in the moment. We would see that the transition period is really important to try and experiment some of the things that you want to try and get to. It has many of the characteristics of the end state that we're likely to get to, you know, restricted supply, new ways of working, communications, and to really try and trial some of these things regarding, am I going to use a red team, blue team approach? Am I going to give it a free for all, first come, first served? Am I going to book it? How do I want to do each of these things? And where's the boundary on choice? Because I don't want to give people too much choice, because that's not going to drive value in the organization. So, you know, really trying to use the transition period. And what we've seen and what we worked on with one client who used the transition period on the way out to move directly to the end state. That they had a long cherished ambition to get all their contact centers virtual, people working remotely. Huge barriers had been put up against that. But when they did the move out of the office, they delayed 3 or 4 weeks, and then they moved to a virtual model, and they told everyone that this is the end state. We're never coming back. And again, so we would expect people to try and use the transition period as well. Say not just that we're piloting new ways of working during transition, but actually this is what it is. And especially if organizations have some of those longer held, clearly agreed objectives, let's just move to them, you know, as soon as we can get back and get those embedded and learned. And certainly, you know, at Deloitte, you know, we've got 15,000 people in London, 25,000 across the UK. So we're looking at this, you know, really hard. We've got big, expensive offices that haven't been used like everyone else. And, you know, we've tried to work at pace on this to try and, you know, very quickly get to an intuitive feel of what the ambition is. And we know, you know, we're talking to more and more organizations who are able to articulate what that ambition might be. And I think that that's, you know, good to get on the table first, because that gives people some focus. But also one of the things that we have looked at is trying to avoid all the mistakes of all the past real estate projects that we've worked on. I mean, we've moved into new headquarters in 2018, and we started working on that on 2014. And when we spent 4 years doing user requirements and everything else like that. But what we have done and what we're doing on how we think about it in future is we've got a very large and successful digital business that builds a lot of digital products. So we've gone and we've borrowed that product mindset of nobody spends 4 years thinking about how you get a software product out. You quickly ideate, and you ideate in a very disruptive manner. You very quickly get to a proof of concept, and you get it out and you get all the stones chucked at it. So, you know, that's again how we think you can inject pace into this. And a lot of that is is forgetting about how we've planned real estate in the past, but really, move to how would we develop a software product that, clients would put as much money in as their real estate. And the sort of the second aspect, and this allows me to kind of hedge my answer of developing a software product, is software products are never finished. They're constantly evolving. You kind of remove yourself from the mindset of saying this is now finished, and therefore, adopting that to the workplace as well. Because one thing that we do know is, our attitudes now to what the new normal might be are going to be different from they were 3 months ago. They're going to be different, positive and negative in 3 months' time when we're still working at home in winter. So we have to accept that, this is a very dynamic environment. And by adopting a product mindset that's saying the workplace is not finished, our designs are not finished, they are going to evolve because our understanding is going to evolve as a business, our needs are going to evolve as a business. And, going into the design of a building with the need to embed structural flexibility to be able to do that is another thing. So, act at pace, but act at pace in a way that allows you to continue to change and evolve, I think are the key messages.
I love that. And I think, you kind of partially answered one of my other questions. So I'm going to move to my backup question, which is, in a tough economy, you can hardly blame people using this quite in a binary way to reduce costs. But I guess one of the things that always worries me when we go into things like this is how do we balance the cost saving with employee satisfaction, brand association and productivity? Because if you don't balance these things up, potentially, I know what you said, which is that we're never done, we're always evolving. I totally subscribe to that. But when you cut and you cut hard, which is potentially what a lot of people are going to do, that can actually have quite a lasting effect on a company's culture, on their operational mindset. So how do we make sure that we go into this and really try and balance out those things?
So a lot of this depends on the sector that you're coming from. I mean, you will know the phrase in banking. Your bonus this year is your job. So it's not much surprise that it's the FS clients who are coming at this with the hardest financial lens and are not moving from that lens. That is the primary lens that everything is going to be viewed for. And therefore, from that perspective, it's getting the organization to understand what are the strategic choices that they are making that impact on employee experience, on how we're going to engage with our clients and customers, what it means from a risk and reg perspective, and how it means kind of operationally. But I think to kind of one of Mike's points, if you want to deliver cost savings out of that, you need less real estate. And if you're taking real estate out, you're not giving people the choice. You're not saying it is up to you where you want to work. You can work at home, you can work remotely. Some organizations are just looking at this through the employee experience lens, and there's no real estate savings on the table, in which case you can give people the choice. But in kind of financial services where you're driving in a cost target, people need to understand, what does that mean? How am I going to limit supply in the organization? Culturally, what does that mean? Am I going to do the free for all? Am I going to tell people that contractually they can't come in on this day? Am I going to tell people it's first come, first served? And as I said earlier, you're going to have to trade off choice against value. So I think in some ways, from the organizations who go into this from a financial, a cost savings lens, it will be, how do I kind of understand what the impact is on the employee experience and mitigate that? Whereas other organizations that we're talking to are not talking about cost, are not seeing, are seeing cost as a benefit that might flow from this, but actually, how can they really transform the organization? How can they maximize the employee experience? How can they really build brand and culture? So, you know, at the heart are the same 4 questions about experience, customers, risk and reg, and operations. Whether you're coming at it from an employee value proposition or a shareholder value proposition will give you a sort of a different take on how you answer those questions.
That's awesome. Look, I'm just conscious of time because we've gone slightly over, and I'm getting the look from Michelle. So maybe we just wrap up, and I ask you one of those really mean questions, and maybe we go in the running order of the speakers. You know, if you could say in one word what you think the future of work means, what would it be? So Joseph, putting you on the spot first. What is your immediate word when you think of future of work?
Oh God, I had to first of all unmute myself there, and now I have to think. You really did catch me there. I mean, kind of balance is for me a word, if I had to choose a word, because I just personally talking right now, I think this idea of a new balance between the office, the home, life, work has been quite a fundamental kind of recognition for me personally. So finding a new balance. Yeah.
Payal?
Human-centered.
Human-centered, love it. Mike?
Fluid.
Oh, fluid, I like it. And Russ?
Opportunity, brilliant, fantastic, amazing opportunity.
Russ.
I love it, love it, love it. So we've got a few more minutes, and I wanted to throw open the floor for questions. Michelle, I'm not sure, can people unmute themselves to put their hand up to ask a question?
As I struggle to unmute myself, yes, they can. Yes, they can.
Michelle, can I come in?
Please do. Yeah.
Guys, I thought this was a fascinating discussion, and one actually I've heard for a number of years, and some of you in the room will know I've talked about some of these issues for probably 15 years. And one of the things that I really want to get to grips with is the leadership skills that are required to manage in this environment, because that's where I think the underinvestment's been. And I'd just like your take on that.
Payal, maybe you can take that one, the leadership.
Sure, happy to take off that one, and fellow panelists do jump in. I would absolutely agree. I think when talking about leadership skills, I think it's as much leadership skills as much as sort of the mindset as well that goes with that. When we're looking at some of the skills that are really coming to the fore, I think it's almost sort of personal resiliency as much as sort of resiliency in terms of, you know, leading an organization and organizational resiliency, right? Because I think this time has really sort of tested leadership. And the organization has had to show up almost as very human in terms of how it kind of really reconnects almost with its sense of purpose and mission. And that has as much tested individual leaders in how they show up. So I think there's a piece there around resiliency. I think the other thing is just, again, things that have been important previously, but are really being tested in this time, which is just how do you navigate ambiguity, right? Because this is uncharted. There is no guidebook, there is no playbook around this. So how do you navigate ambiguity? The other thing then, the third thing for me is just managing that kind of really dispersed teams. Even them closest sort of senior exec table now doesn't sit around the table, right? So how do you manage the rest of the organization in thousands when even your closest 10 are not going to be in the same room with you? So there is this notion of the dispersed team, and what does that mean as a leader to lead in that environment, which is now only virtual. So I think those are the kinds of skill sets that are kind of really need to come into their own. And this needs as much investment in helping leaders with that, rather than assuming that they're going to step into that guise. I think the other thing that I would just say around mindset is this is a time where actually we all need to almost flip into more of a growth mindset mode rather than a fixed mindset. And it's not like one's better than the other, we all have both. But this is a time where we actually need to be honing into our growth mindset more and more, because it is about experimentation. It is about actually learning as we go, and looking at those possibilities that now exist, the opportunities, as Russell mentioned, right? It's about being open to those things rather than defaulting to fixed pathways of how you've known things and how things have happened. And I think that's going to become increasingly important as well.
I can jump in. There was one other survey we've done recently where we actually asked the question of real estate leaders, what roles did they see included in their organizations in the next 2 to 3 years? No surprise, Chief Digital Officer was one. The second was Chief Places Officer, as they try and curate the experience of the destination of work as it becomes much more holistic in what it offers the employee. And the third, which is actually very recently, that Twitter have renamed their head of workplace to be head of remote experience. So maybe that's a sign of things to come.
Kathryn, is it okay if I just point the microphone to Mike for one more second? Mike, you said something before, and I've been jotting down key phrases from each of the panelists, but something that resonated is this, the asynchronize. Yeah, so can you just expand upon that a little bit? I think because it has a web, right? It
Yeah.
touches so many different parts and pieces of what we're all experiencing now, and I think that is a massive recognition. Asynchronize. Yeah.
So the study that I referenced before was done by the founder of Automatic, a guy called McMillan, and he identified 5 stages of asynchronous working. Most people pre-COVID had a kind of a non-deliberate action in terms of the policy for home working. It was ad hoc, do it as you like. The second stage he identified was recreating the office online, and that is a very synchronous process that we're all been in the midst of over the last few months, which is you have calls, you have meetings, and you use Zoom, and it's one-to-one, and it's very deliberate and very real-time and very organized, and it becomes relentless because in order to fit all your meetings and your conversations in, you have to back-to-back your diary with Zoom calls, and you get Zoom fatigue and the likes. But the third stage is when you adapt to the medium of deliberate interventions into remote working, is when you start to move the synchronicity to allow people to respond in their own time. You might start to use distributed teams at different time zones working on the same project, but without having to rely on this immediate communication. And you start to use different forms of communication that are not necessarily verbal. They might be written more than verbal. They might be informal rather than formal. And they happen at many different times of the project's pace, right? And then the fourth phase is when you really start to embrace this asynchronicity. And you start to manage your teams in this way, you manage your communication in this way, and it becomes multi-layered, and different technologies will service different parts of that asynchronous working pattern. And I think we'll start to see more and more companies embracing that now. But right now, most companies are in that phase too, which is we're simply recreating what we did in the office online and remotely, which from our studies, it takes 1 or 2 hours a day longer to get the same work done, and about 48% more mental effort, which is clearly not sustainable.
That is, I think Kathryn's on mute. Let's see.
There we go, I'm unmuted. That's a very rare thing that I'm muted, can I just say? Everybody should enjoy that rare moment. So Rebecca posed a question, which is, how can we protect or even enhance brand and identity with a more dispersed and virtual workforce, both at a team and an organisational level? And maybe I direct that to you, Josef, at the start, and then maybe you come in, Payal and Russ.
I didn't quite hear the question properly, Kathryn.
Sorry, how can we protect or even enhance our brand and identity with a more dispersed and virtual workforce, both at a team level, but also an organisational level?
But you always throw the difficult questions at me,
I
don't
know,
you?
because you're the big thinker.
I mean, that's a really interesting question, right? Because for many firms, at least, the office has increasingly played an important part for brand recognition, i.e., the office experience has been designed to reflect reflect what the firm is about. And many offices have invested in facilities for certain types of client interaction, again, that facilitate that kind of understanding of brand. But I mean, what has always, from my experience at Arab, been kind of quite fundamental to how we perceive our own brand has been, first of all, the values that we bring to our work. And then secondly, kind of what we're trying to achieve with our work. And I think in many cases that can be independent of place and can be quite a unifying feature. So, you know, we have a strong focus on sustainability, like many others have at the moment. We have a strong focus on excellence. We have a strong focus on inclusivity. And so I think as long as those kind of core values still hold true, then it doesn't really matter where you are located and how you're working. You can still feel part that you're part of something and part of a community. And yet, I do also think that that does require perhaps a little bit more effort than it has in the past, because a lot of that kind of feeling of community is, of course, often a physical feeling of being in a crowd and being in a place and listening to someone speak live and having kind of that warm, fuzzy feeling inside that you're in a good place and you're with people who you understand. So what will be those kind of digital interactions going forward that enhance corporate culture and enhance corporate values? Because I think that's actually what it is about. It's less about brand and more about what kind of a remote community actually means.
Love that. And I'm just thinking that from a leadership perspective, because a lot of culture, it comes from leadership, Payal.
Absolutely. And I think I would echo what Joseph just said. I think when you think about this whole notion of brand identity, I think more and more now it's about really connecting with your sense of purpose as an organization. And if you think of Sainsbury's through this crisis, right, their mantra was feeding the nation, right? And they really galvanized around that. I was talking to a bank in the Middle East, and they really got around the statement that they put out there, which was bank from home, stay safe, right? And everything was geared around that. So I think there's this, it's not just about putting mission statements out there, but it's really living your purpose. And for some organizations, including ourselves, we started on a bit of a purpose journey last summer in terms of saying, actually, what does this mean? How do we really connect this into our everyday work? And we co-created it with our people. And we were just almost fortunate in timing that we had started on that journey. And for us, it is about impact that matters. And I find going forward, organizations are really kind of thinking of their own transformation journeys in the context of it being purpose-led and saying, how do I learn from this period? And almost kind of the phrase that I've heard being used, almost bottle the brilliance, which is not to say that this has been, a brilliant period. I mean, there's been a lot of, heaviness and darkness around it as well, but there have been some real learnings in this period, which can inform how we transform going forward. And that should be purpose-led, because that will be so much about enhancing your brand identity.
Yeah, I love that. I absolutely love that. Nita Vasani also asked a question: how can we as managers connect more with our teams if the team members don't want to use video? So, we feel like potentially we're losing that physical connection and contact and the ability to see emotions. How do we do that? So maybe Russ, Mike, what can we do to ensure we don't lose that personal contact with our team members, even if we are virtual?
I mean, this sort of touches a little bit on the need to transform leadership within the organization, and just building on some of the original points. But currently leadership revolves around knowing more than people and being able to navigate your way around the organization. We're changing in the workforce. We are now managing people who know far more than we do on subjects, and the organization is incredibly dynamic. So those two pillars of what leadership and management went are rapidly evolving. So I think the whole notion of how you manage and those kind of two totems, fall, and the whole new leader is about how you engage with people, how you build the skills, how you have the variety, how you build the connection to be able to do it in a way that uses all the different mediums. But again, I don't think anyone is talking about a workplace that is entirely virtual. So how can you then build the engagement around, you know, the time that we still have in the office? And I think that that is important, that, you know, people are still talking about kind of 50, 70% as much real estate as they have today. So there will still be a really important role. And the other thing as well that is important, that, you know, a lot of the debate is about that, are you going to be at home or are you going to be in the office? You know, that's what this has shown. But actually what this has also shown is it has broken a lot of the needs or the thoughts around co-location. You know, think of a bank, you know, the middle office needs to be next to the front office. Well, it's shown that it doesn't need to be. And actually, so how can you unpick some of those things? So actually, you end up with a distributed workplace, and actually, you know, you might end up with more satellite locations. And again, maybe the manager ends up being a bit more like a manager in some other, you know, businesses, and spends more time out engaging with the distributed workplace, the way that a sales manager might go out and meet his kind of regional and local salesmen. So I think it is going to be, you know, reimagining what an office-based, knowledge-based manager and leader looks like, because, you know, regardless in some ways of COVID, so many of these things are changing at such pace.
Mike, can I just build on that 1 second, because I want to ask you a slightly different. So I think this is really fascinating, and one of the things that I think is going to be the most complex thing for companies to navigate is ensuring that that communication is equally distributed both virtually and in person, and that decision making is made both virtually and in person. Otherwise you could really polarize people, and you'll almost make people come back into the office if the only place that things get decided is in the office, in meetings, you know, that take place. I mean, Mike, you manage a really virtual team, and you speak with clients all the time. How can you see this evolving?
It's interesting. Could I just also touch on the first question, which was around the management of individuals when you don't physically see them, because it does talk to the reshaping of the purpose of the office. And we've heard various phrases used. I mean, CBRE have used the idea of a trophy office. Others have used the idea of a clubhouse office. Yeah. And I think we will start to see that the functionality of the office in terms of engagement and in terms of the community, in terms of the brand and the leadership, will be reshaped by this crisis, and actually for the positive, I think, in terms of creating a place which reinforces brand, but also reinforces relationships with the workers, not necessarily in a work context, whether that's providing gym and yoga classes at a sort of smaller level, or retreats and breakouts and learning and showcasing of ideas, etc. But on the second point, which is around ensuring there's inclusivity between those remote and those physical, what I've actually been having discussions with some clients around is the idea that historically primacy of a communication was physical first, virtual second. Yes. And if you were outside the room, you were second class, and if you couldn't be heard, tough, we'll call you later. And many organizations are saying the primacy will be virtual, even if we're all physically in the room. So you start to make it far more inclusive by making virtual your primary communication sort of guideline, if you want to call it that. What that does imply, though, is that the spaces that we create need to be able to accommodate significantly the changes in acoustic expectation. It used to be meetings were closed in quiet rooms. Increasingly, we'll have people on virtual calls throughout the office. So I think we're going to see a lot more need to invest in small cubicles and places where people can do these calls without disturbing the flow and the kind of concentration of everyone around them. So it's going to be interesting how the design impact of that follows on.
Amazing. Well, look, I think by some miracle, we're actually going to come in on time. So thank you. I can't thank you enough, panel. Absolutely superb. Certainly given me, I've been furiously writing notes on my paper script because I'm still that sad. But just thank you so much. And all I can say to folks is, if you have any questions that you haven't been able to post today, please still email them through to Crew, and we'll make sure we get an answer back to you anyway. But thank you so much, and I hope everybody's enjoyed this evening. I certainly have. So thank you.